Hellenic Greece represents a high point of human history, and specifically a high point in the Western tradition. Their sculpture and artwork seemed divinely inspired. Their poets and thinkers and writers are to this very day among the best the world has ever produced. Up until fairly recently, all of Europe felt a living connection to this past, that strongest of genetic and cultural bonds that causes such a profound feeling of resonance on viewing the masterful creations in stone and marble, or reading the profound and thoughtful works of Plato or Heraclitus, or those lofty words of Homer. The German philosopher Hegel went so far as to state, "At the name of Greece, the cultivated German finds himself at home. All that makes life satisfying and elevates and adorns it, we derive directly or indirectly from Greece." Voltaire once paid the highest compliment to the famous court of Frederick the Great by proclaiming it, quote, "was Sparta in the morning, Athens in the afternoon." And author Madison Grant compared the Sparta and Athens relationship of martial discipline and artistic mastery to Prussia and France, and considered this combination to be the ideal. Hellenic Greece was almost universally acknowledged as a breath of fresh air, a flowering of mind, body, and soul, an exceptional people who cultivated for themselves an exceptional existence, which inevitably produced exceptional art, heroes, and ideals. Ancient Troy, one of the most intriguing mysteries in the historical record, and one that captivated the hearts and minds of the Western world for centuries. The events that took place in this region over the span of just over 10 years shook the world and would leave a lasting imprint on the Western psyche, stretching up to this very day. They inspired one of the first transcendent works of heroic literature in Homer's Iliad, a creation that stands to this very day as one of the greatest works ever penned, as well as one of the most quintessentially Western, or Aryan. The very first book printed in English was another account of this pivotal event, firing the imaginations of entire generations, as it remained the most popular book throughout much of Europe for centuries. Many of the greatest works of art were directly inspired by the fall of Troy. The lineage of the royal houses of Europe traced back to the figures involved, and historical figures such as Alexander the Great, Xerxes, and the earliest emperors of Rome all paid personal homage to the site and its heroes. Both Rome and Britain were alleged to have been founded by aristocratic ancestral lines fleeing Troy after its complete decimation at the hands of their brother Greeks, who were another offshoot of this singular bloodline. This period of history, this region, and the events contained within both represent something akin to a very real Game of Thrones, one that needs no hype or exaggeration to be one of the most important stories ever told. And yet, within a few hundred years, our understanding of all things Troy changed completely. Homer's account of the events was called into question, and then the validity of Homer himself as a historical personality was challenged. The root historical sources he drew from, long believed to be passed down from men directly involved in the events, were suddenly labeled frauds. Our understanding of the conflict itself became muddied and confused, with some suddenly questioning if it occurred at all, and finally proclaiming that Troy itself probably didn't exist, but was rather some fanciful invention. Flash forward to the present day, and Troy is a mere footnote of history, poorly understood, if at all, by most modern students, and mentioned in passing, and often derisively or dismissively by modern professors. The last major production on the theme was the BBC and Netflix production Troy, Fall of a City, in which the most renowned warrior of them all, Achilles, universally described in historical accounts with blonde hair and fair skin, is played by a man whose ancestors hail from Ghana. An acceptable change, says the New Yorker, because they consider Achilles to be fake anyway, so, quote, "imaginative license in casting seems perfectly acceptable," end quote. If you search Wikipedia to better understand who the Trojan people were, you'll find nothing. Literally no entry. Google Dorian invasion from most regions, and this will be your first result. It's incredible. Though we've lost all in-depth understanding of our own roots and origins, and subsequently our recognition of the importance of this understanding, it's been cleverly replaced with a substitution we can all experience vicariously, created by teams of writers out of thin air. We no longer have any grounding in who or what we are, or where we've come from, but we've managed to replace all of these pesky concerns with an invented fantasy reality, one which it's been deemed safe to discuss freely. I sincerely hope everyone listening to these words will give some thought to just how dangerous this is, how devastating the ramifications of tossing out such a wealth of valuable historical context, all of the great tales and myths and legends of our ancestors. These events and the stories that grew up around them are informative and shaping, meant to be guiding and teaching tools, and sources of inspiration and energy and life force. The generations who paved the way for us hoped that their sacrifices might be remembered, and that their lives and the manner in which they lived them might be recounted. Not for petty reasons of ego, but as examples of right thinking, right living, right being, and ideals to strive to equal. We now live in some Twilight Zone reality in which we allow a handful of men in Hollywood and New York to completely reinvent our past, to shape our present, and thereby orient our course for the future, severing our roots and replacing them with artificial concoctions, springing from minds that, for the most part, aren't exactly students or admirers of Western culture. I don't mean to pass judgment on those deeply invested in shows like Game of Thrones. They're technically well-made productions, and the massive interest so many feel for them comes from a good place. We're desperate for some real connection to and understanding of our past, and the archetypal essence behind it all. A starving individual isn't going to hold out for a healthy and natural, well-rounded meal. He's going to latch upon anything edible that's nearby and make the best of his lot. I'm simply arguing that an exceptional feast lies just out of reach, and we're contenting ourselves with some cheap soda and heavily processed cheese from a can, albeit attractively packaged. To anyone that might claim that events like the fall of Troy and so many others throughout the very real historical record aren't at least the equal of anything being churned out by the wizard behind the curtain of popular culture today, I'd argue that perhaps you haven't read them with open eyes. There's simply no comparison. These are objectively great tales, overflowing with pathos and energy and spirit and depth, whereas so much in our age has become a copy of a copy of a copy, exaggerated for effect, and thereby simultaneously caricatured and cheapened. Slowly but surely, we're awakening to the power of truths at the core of our history. And someday soon, I hope these healthier and more powerful tales might be brought back to life and embraced once again. One other very important point before we begin. The historical record has become less interesting, less inspired, and infused with natural energy, in large part because in our age academics choose to view it through an artificial framework of their own subjective design. The ancients didn't see the world in terms of firm national boundaries drawn on a map. This was a world structured according to kinship and ancestral lines. Terms like Hellenic or Royal Scythian were as much racial designations as anything, and one couldn't become either of these merely by moving into the geographical area. It's no coincidence that so many ancient texts are filled with detailed accounts of lineage. It's recently become the fashion within modern academia, here as in so many other respects, to paint our ancestors as inveterate liars, creating detailed family trees solely for nefarious purposes of basking in undeserved glory. I feel these accusations of petty motives are a case of projection. I find it strange that we now mistrust and dismiss so many ancient historical accounts as a default academic position. If we didn't have so much documented footage in this age of technology, it'd be easy to imagine a future in which some bespectacled intellectual would pronounce in supremely confident tones that, of course, there was no former TV star as President of the United States, You see, people like to feel as if they live in exciting times, so they'll often make up stories. He'd speak this sagely, of course, as most viewers nodded in bovine agreement, and then he'd proceed to doubt whether a Donald Trump even existed as a person at all, with perhaps a condescending laugh directed at those who believed otherwise, and then go on to create several elaborate reasons as to why he probably didn't exist. And this is just one of the many reasons I encourage everyone to seek out root historical sources and beware the derivatives and speculation of academics, who merely create their own subjective interpretations of these root sources, and all too often do so according to modern prejudices and politically correct cultural whims. Once upon a time, there was a significant overlap between our heroes and our bards. The great Greek thinkers and poets were usually courageous men of well-rounded and multifaceted education, who more often than not fought in the battles of their age. Times have changed, unfortunately, in this age of self-professed experts. And for the record, I certainly don't claim the title of expert myself. I'm merely someone who's worked hard to build a context picture that makes sense. Someone that seeks only to make corrections to the prevailing narrative in those cases where the truth of the matter seems to have been egregiously violated or overstepped. So, to set the stage, I believe that of course Troy existed, and that we almost certainly know its location. I believe the battle Homer references, as well as the eventual fall of Troy, both came to pass. I've even come to believe, strongly, that the individuals mentioned in the tale, from Achilles to Menelaus, to Priam, to Agamemnon, also existed. And if their exploits have been exaggerated by some throughout the years, this is hardly grounds for their dismissal as living and breathing human beings. In short, it's my opinion that the only things up for serious debate are the details. Was there an actual Trojan horse? Was Helen forcibly kidnapped, or was there some willingness? Which individuals bear the blame for the hostilities, and so forth. Though I feel that these answers matter far less than the broader picture. I believe the Hellenic Greek element that waged such a brutal and prolonged war against Troy, one which likely took place around 1200 BC and over the span of 10 years and raged all along the western coast of Anatolia, with Troy as its central flashpoint, was a battle between men of very similar stock, language, and culture. While it's likely those at Troy spoke a dialect we now call Luwian, there's no evidence of any need for translators of any sort when those from Greece and Troy visited one another's courts. And there seems to have been several intermarriages and close familial relationships between the two, to the extent that many were torn throughout the course of the war as to which side to support. They also had several shared heroes, customs, and traditions. To cite what purports to be a first-hand account by Dictys of Crete, quote, "Trojan princes and Trojan allies, it is a sad thing for us to be at war with the Greeks, but an even sadder and more painful thing that for the sake of a woman we have made enemies of the closest friends, of those who, being descendants of Pelops, are joined to us even by ties of marriage." End quote. However, we should stop for a moment here to clarify terms and descriptors. Greek is a lazy umbrella term here. In reality, there were several fairly distinct peoples mixing in this region. Kretschmer argues that there were three major waves of movements into Greece, beginning with the Proto-Ionian element in about 2000 BC, perhaps better referred to as Pelasgian, followed by a Proto-Achaean element around 1600 BC, and finally a Dorian element around 1200 BC. Herodotus seems to agree here, and saying, quote, "The chief peoples were the Lacedaemonians among those of Doric stock, and the Athenians among those of Ionic stock. These races, Ionian and Dorian, were the foremost in ancient time, the first a Pelasgian and the second a Hellenic people. The Pelasgian race has never yet left its home. The Hellenic race has wandered often and far." End quote. Much like I'd mentioned in earlier videos, these waves seem to be migrations of what was likely once a singular racial stock. Having said this, there do seem to be some noteworthy differences. The more indigenous Pelasgian and Ionian stock seem to have been a bit more quiet and peaceful, a bit more attached to the land, perhaps a bit shorter in stature, and more similar in physical appearance to those dark-haired Minoans and Mycenaeans pictured on so many walls and frescoes in the region. Of the Achaeans, historian J. Bagnall Bury states, quote, "It is uncertain at what time the Achaeans made their first appearance in the Greek peninsula. They were a people of blonde complexion, of Indo-European speech, who came down from the regions of the Danube and made conquests in Thessaly and the plain of Sperchios. In the course of time, some of their chieftains won lordship over the Peloponnesus, in Argolis and Laconia, probably by marriages with the daughters of the old Greek dynasties. It is not probable that the Achaean invaders came in great numbers. They formed a small ruling class who were soon assimilated in speech and manners to their Greek subjects. They did not work destruction. They won lordship and leadership, and their adventurous spirit guided Greece to great enterprises." End quote. There's an intriguing reference to an encounter on the battlefield of the champions Glaucus and Diomedes, who end up thrusting their spears into the ground, embracing one another as brothers, and exchanging armor, as they recall their ancestral ties. Both are mentioned as being amongst the greatest of the Achaean warriors, yet one seems to represent the Achaean continental Greek royal house, and the other the Achaean royal house in Asia Minor. This anecdote, like so many others, seems to illustrate two things. Firstly, the close ancestral connection between the rulership of Greece and Troy. Secondly, that an Achaean royal line dominated the region of the day. The final major wave that formed the composite we've come to know as Hellenic Greece, the Dorians, entered the scene more like rampaging lions. Historians and scholars have long remarked on their seemingly extreme focus on the martial and militaristic, and I tend to think there's a relatively clear-cut explanation for the extremity of this trait. There's an intriguing passage in Plato's Laws in which he speaks of the birth of the Dorians as a subset of the Achaeans. Quote, "Now, during this period of 10 years, while the siege lasted, the affairs of each of the besiegers at home suffered much, owing to the seditious conduct of the young men. For when the soldiers returned to their own cities and homes, these young people did not receive them fittingly and justly, but in such a way that there ensued a vast number of cases of death, slaughter, and exile. So they, being again driven out, migrated by sea. And because Dorius was the man who banded together the exiles, they got the new name of Dorians, instead of Achaeans. But as to all the events that follow this, you Lacedaemonians relate them all fully in your traditions." End quote. In other words, it seems the Dorians came to be a self-selected subset of those most courageous Greeks that sailed off to fight at Troy. So not only were they innately something of a military caste, but now we add to this their anger at being expelled from their own homes, and we have a recipe for the future martial mindset of the Spartans, who would reach the peak of their power and control some 600 or so years later. And with regards to the Dorians, we have another extremely intriguing citation from Herodotus, who was likely of Dorian descent himself. In tracing their lineage, he follows the ancestral line of descent up to Perseus, and then says, quote, "If we follow the line of Danae, daughter of Acrisius, and trace her progenitors, we shall find that the chiefs of the Dorians are really genuine Egyptians. In the genealogies here given, I have followed the common Greek accounts." End quote. And then he proceeds to add the mysterious, quote, "Enough, however, of this subject, how it came to pass that Egyptians obtained the kingdoms of the Dorians, and what they did to raise themselves to such a position. These are questions concerning which, as they have been well treated by others, I shall say nothing. I proceed to speak on points which no other writer has touched." End quote. This seems to indicate that other authors of his time, whose writings have somehow been lost to posterity, covered this topic in depth. When we recall the fact that so many of the most ancient pharaohs that we have yet to unearth have been found with fair hair intact, and that the genetic testing of Tutankhamun showed a direct connection to northwestern Europeans, yet virtually no connection to modern-day Egyptians, and when we further consider the wealth of finds in Sumeria and surrounding territories, depicting their leaders and gods with blue eyes, and Sargon the Great's comments about ruling over a black-headed people, the idea of an Indo-European element with fair features existing in the region is more than a possibility, but rather seems an obvious factual reality. The ancestral and cultural connections between the Persians, Scythians, Greeks, and others to places like ancient Sumer and Egypt seems far stronger than modern academics seem willing to credit, all the way back to the dawn of recorded history and beyond. And even Helen herself, after being taken by Priam prior to the Trojan War, seems to have spent her years in Egypt during the hostilities. And of course, we have a Thebes in Greece, which Homer seemed to consider of the greatest antiquity, and a Thebes in Egypt, something which many academics attempt to this day to pass off as pure coincidence. And with regard to the racial character of Hellenic Greece and Troy, thankfully we have several accounts, the best of which exist in the masterful artistic products of their own hands, including sculpture that remains to this day among the greatest ever produced. The 5th century poet Pindar, hailing from Greek Thebes, referred to the Greeks as the fair-haired Danoi, and fragments from a 150 BC travelogue describe the women of Thebes in particular as, quote, the tallest, prettiest, and most graceful in all of Hellas. Their yellow hair is tied up in a knot on the top of their head, end quote. The Spartan Alcman was one of the first ancient voices who praised the athletic Spartan females, specifically mentioning their golden hair and silver or light gray eyes. Even as late as the 4th century AD, Adamantius, an Alexandrian physician and scientist, wrote in his Physiognomica that of all the nations, the Greeks have the fairest eyes, adding that wherever the Hellenic and Ionic race has been kept pure, we see tall men of fairly broad and straight build, of fairly light skin and blonde, end quote. And of course, the list of gods and goddesses and heroes with similar features is far too large to cover here. But what I find even more interesting is the physical accounts written down in the first-hand account of the events of Troy, authored by one Dares of Phrygia, of those more mysterious citizens of Troy itself. I find his writing style fascinating, and that he chooses to give a brief physical and psychological description of nearly every major figure involved, a document now completely out of print, which should surprise no one, that I've linked below this video along with the other purported first-hand account of Troy. Nearly all of the figures are described as having either fair skin, eyes, or hair, with a large percentage of these, too, being blonde, such as Agamemnon, who was described as, quote, blonde, large, and powerful. He was eloquent, wise, and noble, end quote. And to give one particularly amusing example, Polyxena was fair, tall, and beautiful. Her neck was slender, her eyes lovely, her hair blonde and long, her body well proportioned, her fingers tapering, her legs straight, and her feet the best. Surpassing all others in beauty, she remained a completely ingenuous and kind-hearted woman. The second account of Troy, which claims to be first-hand, is called the Dictys Cretensis, authored by Dictys of Crete. Like so many other ancient sources, both documents were accepted as pieces of the historical record up until fairly recent times, during which academics have led the charge to label both as frauds or inventions, a stance I can't help but be extremely skeptical of. It's thought both may have been used by Homer in crafting his account, along with other sources we no longer have access to. But what's additionally fascinating is that each represents an account from an opposite side of the battle, and in reading both, it's easy to see how each side might have blamed one another, and how an event that Herodotus claims was sparked by a misunderstanding might have snowballed into one of the most monumental and impactful wars in Western history, between two equally stubborn and prideful and powerful foes. It's unfortunate that Dares' account is so short. So little has come down to us about the nature of Troy and her people, and no doubt, much like the burning of Alexandria, the complete destruction of Troy likely meant that many written records, or the bards and storytellers that might write them, were lost forever. On this topic, there's a curious mystery that to this day remains unsolved, involving what we today call Troy towns, which usually manifest as turf-cut mazes, though are sometimes created with stones. A popular theory was that these were representations of the ancient labyrinth of Crete. Another, that they represent the layout of Troy, or the concentric circles of Atlantis, as Plato described it, or both. There were once thousands of these, scattered throughout Europe and Scandinavia, and hundreds still exist to this day, with the majority being found in Sweden. Yet, incredibly, they're even found in places like Egypt, India, and Peru. One of the more intriguing theories is that these symbols are tied to Archaim, the studiously ignored archaeological site on the Russian steppes with a layout so closely resembling that of Troy, deemed Swastika City due to the prevalence of swastikas discovered in the area. Also dubbed the Russian Stonehenge, and dating back at least 4,000 years, though recent evidence indicates 5,000 to 6,000 years may be a better estimate. And its construction indicates that the builders had advanced astronomical knowledge, and the site itself may have been something of an observatory, one which was mysteriously burned down and abandoned, essentially overnight. Because this site exists in that vast area representing the stomping grounds of those ancient Aryans who left almost no written records, our old friends the Scythians, it's important to speak about the likely connections here. It's well known that there were extensive contacts between the Scythians and Greeks, with royal Scythians intermarrying often with Greeks and Thracians, and often providing elite military squadrons and bodyguard contingents to protect leadership, similar to the Praetorian Guard, which would later make its appearance in Rome. The Achaeans and Dorians were said to have come from the regions of the Danube, as quoted by J. Bagnall-Beery earlier. The Scythians, occupying vast tracts of territory north of Greece, claimed Heracles, also known as Hercules, as the progenitor of their race. And the Dorians' push down into Greece has long been known as the return of the Heraclidae, and was seen as the reclaiming of land that was rightfully theirs, granted to them by their own progenitor, Heracles. Such was the strong connection between the Greeks and Scythians that the two peoples named the Calapidae and the Alazones, on the border between Greece and Scythian lands, were essentially a blend between the two. Achilles, widely hailed as the greatest of those Greeks who fought at Troy, may have been both Greek and Scythian himself. Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon, quoting the more ancient Greek historian Arrian of Nicomedia, outright says that Achilles was a Scythian, who had been banished to Thessaly due to his hot temper. Alcaeus, the Greek poet of the 6th century BC, referred to Achilles as the Lord of Scythia. During the war with the Trojans, there are multiple offhand references in the Dictys Cretensis to Greek and Scythian cooperation, especially between Achilles and the Scythian king. Arriving back with Achilles, after he'd engaged in multiple coastal raids on Troy outposts, the Scythian king, quote, having learned that our men had arrived, came and brought many gifts. Much of the gold artwork of these two peoples was so similar that many Scythian pieces were long thought to be Greek in origin, and it's thought that the Scythian curved bow was adopted by the Greeks. The Dorian and Scythian genealogies match astonishingly well, each hearkening back to 3 brothers, in which power was granted to the youngest, and speak of 3 social divisions akin to a producer class, a priest class, and a warrior class. The Scythians were everywhere referred to by Greek writers as warriors who held all things in common, aside from their sword and drinking cup, and the Spartiates were spoken of as having similar customs. So it's interesting to compare this to the line from Plato's Critias, who, in discussing Atlantis and the origins of the Hellenic people, speaks of, quote, a superior class of warriors who dwelt apart, and were educated and had all things in common, like our guardians. And then later he goes on to state, quote, and so they passed their lives as guardians of the citizens and leaders of the Hellenes. They were a just and famous race, celebrated for their beauty and virtue all over Europe and Asia. Now, before we go further here, it's important to make clear that I'm not claiming the Greeks were Scythians, any more than I'm claiming the Scythians were Greeks, but rather that these two labels conceal another labeling mechanism that was likely more widely used and more comfortable to those in the ancient world, the ancestral. The Hellenic and Scythian appear more like 2 branches from a single root, It gets even more interesting. Herodotus mentions 3 nations, or their royal houses, tracing back to Heracles, who, again, I can't help but believe was a very real person, even if many of the tales of his specific deeds might be inventions or exaggerations. These 3 nations are the Scythians, the Dorians, and the Lydians. Lydian was the name for those occupying the region of Troy. And so once again we find a direct genetic tie that binds the major powers of the day. And finally, to tie virtually the whole of the ancient world together, we've already mentioned that the Buddha was almost certainly of Aryan stock, of the Saka or Sakai people, but Ashoka as well, widely hailed as one of India's greatest rulers, a famed conqueror turned Buddhist peacemaker, responsible for the Ashoka chakra, which became the basis for the Indian flag, and bears a striking resemblance to the royal symbol of Macedonia, was of Greek descent. The famous Ashoka pillars, which show a connection to both Greek and Persian architecture, were among the most prominent targets of Muslim iconoclasm, with only a few remaining intact in the present day. The Persian ruling elite, the Achaemenids, note the linguistic similarity here to the Achaean, marked their descent from Achaemenes, son of Perseus, half-brother of Heracles. Ancient Persia was the epitome of an Aryan empire, prior to their conquest of much of the known world, turning them into a stew of varied peoples, much like Rome would become later. Persia would develop close ties with Lydia, and thus consider the Trojan War an affront by the Greeks, and this was the catalyst for so much bad blood and future conflict between Greek and Persian. In fact, Herodotus opens his landmark work, Histories, recounting the Persian opinion of the war as the fault of the Greeks, and their claim that the incident with Helen was an overreaction, siding with the Trojan perspective that she'd not have gone back to Troy with Priam unless she wanted to. It's said that the Phoenicians set all of this in motion initially, a people the Greeks seemed to view as closely related to the later Trojans, by carrying off the Greek royal Io, the daughter of the king of Argos, Inachus, to Egypt. The Greeks are said to have retaliated, courtesy of an incident in Tyre, where the Greeks were accused of stealing away the king's daughter Europa, and then in a second incident in which the Greeks, likely Jason himself, from the story of Jason and the Argonauts, carried off Medea, another king's daughter. Regardless of the spark that ignited the blaze, I believe the Battle of Troy really was all it was made out to be, a clash of lions, highly skilled warriors in their prime, fighting for honor and glory, to be sure, but also to decide, as the Dictus Cretensis states, who would rule the world. And indeed, Troy's fall made it possible for the Greeks to carve out an empire the likes of which few powers would ever equal. And depending on whether you believe ancient historians or modern academics, provided the root stock in both Rome and Britain of future empires that would one day do the same, as a large party of defeated Trojans was forced to relocate to these distant outposts after their loss. Virgil's Aeneid, among several other accounts, reports the royal Aeneas escaping the destruction of Troy and making his way to Italy, as his grandson Brutus is said to have journeyed to Britain, founding a city he called New Troy, later known as London. Though several BBC articles and assorted academics mock and deride this tale, I've yet to see any evidence overturning the scores of more ancient accounts which plainly saw this event as factual, and up until the last century it was universally accepted. To give one evidentiary example, the historian Geoffrey of Monmouth cites an intriguing letter from the British king, quote, Cassibelan, king of the Britons, to Caius Julius Caesar. We cannot but wonder, Caesar, at the avarice of the Roman people, since their insatiable thirst after money cannot let us alone, whom the dangers of the ocean have placed in a manner out of the world. But they must have the presumption to covet our substance, which we had hitherto enjoyed in quiet. Neither is this, indeed, sufficient. We must also prefer subjection and slavery to them, before the enjoyment of our native liberty. Your demand, therefore, Caesar, is scandalous, since the same vein of nobility flows from Aeneas in Britain and Romans, and one and the same chain of consanguinity shines in both, which ought to be a band of firm union and friendship. That was what you should have demanded of us, not slavery. We have learned to admit of the one, but never to bear the other. And so much we have been accustomed to liberty that we are perfectly ignorant what it is to submit to slavery. And even if the gods themselves should attempt to deprive us of our liberty, we would, to the utmost of our power, resist them in the defense of it. Know then, Caesar, that we are ready to fight for that and our kingdom if, as you threaten, you shall attempt to invade Britain. Unfortunately, it's not my aim in this video to recount the battles themselves. Homer's poetic account of the hostilities is without parallel here. But I did want to mention a few of the lesser-known elements. First, the Dictys account mentions Amazons coming to assist Troy, and Achilles himself striking their leader with his spear, before then seizing her by her hair to pull her off her horse, an event immortalized in several sculptures since. The hero and his fiery Greeks were in no mood to be as kind to the Amazons as the Scythians had been in their earlier encounters. Quote, "Finding Penthesilea still half alive, we marveled at her brazen boldness. Almost immediately, a meeting was held to determine her fate, and it was decided to throw her, while still alive enough to have feeling, either into the river to drown or for the dogs to tear apart, for she had transgressed the bounds of nature and her sex." End quote. Because the hostilities raged for 10 long years, the Greeks even farmed the land nearby Troy's walls to keep the army fed, and both sides reportedly took long breaks over winter. Trojan and Greek even mixed freely in the sacred grove during this time. There's also mention of games and sports in the long period between battles, including an archery contest in which a dove was suspended high in the air, hung by a string between 2 masts. Ulysses and Meriones were said to have been the only ones that hit the mark, only to be outdone by the winner, Philoctetes, who claimed, and then proceeded to prove, he could cut the string itself with his first arrow. Achilles, it's said, awarded him a double prize for this feat. The massive Ajax carried off all prizes for the boxing matches, and it's said that Diomedes won the foot race, which took place in full armor, a contest which would later go on to be one of the most popular Olympic events. Finally, this wasn't just a battle of sword and spear. Chariots and cavalry, those mainstays of the ruling caste of the ancient world, were used far more often than one might suspect, based on popular accounts, especially by the heroes and leaders themselves. One of the many reasons I've always looked back in humbled awe at the history of the Aryan peoples is their track record of flexible and adaptive problem-solving ability, the very definition of intelligence. It strikes me that the true test here, when faced with a vastly complex problem, with hidden variables and unknowns, and often no clear and simple historical precedent to draw from with regards to solving it, is this. Does one crumble under the weight, run or hide, or engage in mental gymnastics to pretend the problem doesn't really exist? Or does one find the energy and strength of spirit to face the problem head on, and work to create right order and healthy structure in the face of our natural inclination as human beings towards chaos and degeneration? This problem-solving ability is of the highest and broadest sort. It's not the silly bookish understanding of intelligence and education that modern schooling so drills into our heads, whereby children are rewarded for memorization and regurgitation of facts, but a multifaceted merit, capable of adapting and adjusting to anything thrown its way, capable of creative and independent thought, not the follower of rulebooks and guides, but capable of creating them when the need arises. I wanted to end this video dedicated to a prime example of this, and highlighting a people that represent a tall peak in the history of human achievement. The famed Spartans were a branch of the Dorians who, in turn, were a branch of the Achaeans. And they weren't always those Spartans we've come to know of today. Initially, when their world seemed pleasant and well-ordered, they were, by all accounts, a pleasure-loving folk, fond of dance, song, pioneers in music, known for beautiful pottery and the most delicate and intricate ivory carvings. with their subconscious shaped by the events following the Trojan War, in which their Dorian forefathers weren't allowed to return home, and subsequently observing a rise in degeneracy and mob revolts, a falling away of discipline and order, they put away these habits almost overnight. Under the guiding hand of a man named Lycurgus, they were to reshape themselves into a martial elite without equal, capable of governing over a servile class of helots that outnumbered them at times nearly 10 to 1. This was a people that sought to be masters of men not through deceit or trickery or manipulation, but by being harder on themselves than those around them, and thus crafting themselves into individuals not only worthy of dominance, but fully capable of acquiring and maintaining it.
The Spartans came up with their own take on colonization. They turned their eyes west and began to wonder what opportunities there were beyond the mountains. It was there that they would go to satisfy their land hunger. It was there that Shangri-La would reveal its darker side, because it was there that a slave nation would be created to serve the Spartan master race.
Seeing themselves as an aristocratic elite, they aimed to prove this by being this, clearly to all, and in doing so created a societal framework geared towards a single purpose, the cultivation of warriors. As a first step to prevent corruption, Lycurgus forbade any citizen to engage in commerce. Amusingly and creatively, he limited currency to the use of cumbersome iron spits, to the extent that even a moderate purchase might require enough to, quote, fill a good-sized wagon. Lycurgus was equally disdainful towards democracy, which most noble Greeks of the day viewed as mob rule, ultimately a system at the whim of those who were most willing and able to deceive, manipulate, and control the mob. Legend has it that when confronted by a supporter of democracy, he urged the man to, quote, start with your own family. Unlike Athens, who would eventually shift in this general direction prior to its decline, Sparta was to be shaped into a hierarchy of merit, self-discipline, hardness, and courage. At the age of 7, their boys were sent to live in a communal militaristic barracks, to undergo a well-rounded education with a militaristic focus, and were encouraged to make their own beds from reeds, to sleep outside, and even haze and spar with each other, in the constructive manner of brothers seeking to improve one another. Spartan girls at the same age were sent to learn dance and gymnastics, and were even taught to ridicule the boys to toughen their skin. In the infamous contest of endurance at the altar of Artemis, cheese was placed at the top, as the boys would compete to reach it, being flogged as they attempted to do so. The best of these children would graduate to the rite of passage of the Kritia. According to Plutarch, every autumn the Spartan ephors would formally declare war on the Helots, allowing any Spartan to kill a Helot if he felt wholly justified in doing so. Young Spartans would then roam the Laconian countryside armed with knives, targeting the most rebellious among their subjects. But to add to the challenge, they were forced to do so in secret, for to be caught meant a severe flogging, teaching them to be not merely strong, but also stealthy, quick, and confident. Only those who showed success here were likely to attain positions of leadership, restricting the command of Spartan armies to the most tried and true. Even their music became martial, and their famed phalanx was known to advance at walking speed accompanied by rhythmic music and chants, a practice they studied intently. They laughed at the concept of walls as contrary to their nature, and the Spartan king Agesilaus, when touring neighboring cities, walls, and defenses, was said to have remarked, "fine quarters" for women. And when asked where his own walls were, he pointed to his troops, saying, "These are Sparta's walls." Though their prowess was universally recognized by their neighbors, they were far from bullies, and in fact were known to be notoriously cautious about committing to wars, often showing tremendous restraint. When allies would ask for their aid, the Spartans were known to send a single tactician or advisor, rather than an army, similar to the Germans lending out their general or officer staff to their allies. Punishment for cowards was extremely severe, because it was engaged in naturally by the entire community, a bit like Amish shunning, but far more impactful. peers were embarrassed to share a meal with them. They were left out of sporting events, had to give the right of way on the streets, had to turn over their seats at events to younger men. Women refused to marry them. They were often forced to wear embarrassing rags and sport half-shaven beards. In short, until they reversed their shame, they were second-class citizens, and they were made to feel this difference. Much like the Scythians, although the Spartan woman's place was at home and hearth, devoted to that most important of professions of shaping the next generation, they were shown great respect. Even the least of them were apparently highly prized and paid as nannies and caretakers by other Greeks. And there's a well-known story of an Attic Greek woman once asking, "How is it you Spartan women are the only ones who exercise some control over your men?" Only to receive the reply, "Because we are the only ones that give birth to men." In our age, weak and degenerate individuals largely call the tune and have worked to equate healthy masculinity with brutish stupidity, and many have no doubt come to view the Spartans themselves in this mold. Socrates corrects us here. Quote, "They conceal their wisdom and pretend to be blockheads, so that they may seem to be superior only because of their prowess in battle. This is how you may know that I am speaking the truth, and that the Spartans are the best educated in philosophy and speaking. If you talk to any ordinary Spartan, he seems to be stupid, but eventually, like an expert marksman, he shoots in some brief remark that proves you to be only a child." End quote. And though they spoke little, what few offerings they did provide reverberate down through the ages. The king of Macedonia and Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, far from a weak man himself, reportedly flew into a rage at the Spartans sending just one ambassador, as opposed to the usual retinue, to deal with him. "Aye," the ambassador replied, "one ambassador to one king." After invading Greece and attaining several victories, Philip sent a message saying, "If I invade Laconia, you'll be destroyed, never to rise again." The Spartans, confident they could stop him before he'd done so, replied with a single word, "If." Meeting the Persian governor of the seacoast of Asia, Hydarnes, they refused to fall before him and do obeisance as all other nations had, stating it wasn't their custom to worship men, and that they hadn't come to Persia for that purpose. Hydarnes is said to have promised them great rewards, stating, quote, "Men of Lacedaemon, why will you not consent to be friends with the king? Ye have but to look at me and my fortune to see that the king knows well how to honor merit. In like manner ye yourselves, were ye to make your submission to him, would receive at his hands, seeing that he deems you men of merit, some government in Greece." "Hydarnes," they answered, "thou art a one-sided counselor. Thou hast experience of half the matter, but the other half is beyond thy knowledge. A slave's life thou understandest, but never having tasted liberty, thou canst not tell whether it be sweet or no. Ah, hadst thou known what freedom is, thou wouldst have bidden us fight for it." End quote. And fight for it they did, heavily outnumbered at the famous last stand at the hot gates of Thermopylae. Facing an army anywhere from 10 to 100 times their size, depending on which account one chooses to trust, an army set to drink rivers dry and fire off enough arrows to blot out the sun, the Spartans quipped, "So much the better, we will fight in the shade." And after again being offered wealth and land and other enticements to put down their arms, they steadfastly refused, offering only that ever-relevant reply that echoes through the ages, "Come and take." In what was to go down in history as one of the most powerful displays of martial excellence, genuine courage, and masterful discipline, an army of over 100,000 men was held off and delayed for 7 days by this handful of lofty souls that chose to sacrifice all for everything they loved best, and by doing so, bought their armies enough time to potentially change the course of the entire war. This Spartan defense against Persia is analogous to our situation today. Spartans considered these late Empire Persians to be corrupt and degenerate powermongers, seeking to stamp out freedom and sovereignty. And let's be frank about our situation in the West. We stand at a very real precipice. facing dangers of a sort never before experienced by our predecessors, and must now answer that weightiest of questions, to be or not to be. We stand on the brink of collapse. We either find a means of cultivating and harnessing inspired leadership once again, in that Marcus Aurelius mold, those that see power not as a privilege or as a means of personal gain or as an end in and of itself, but as the greatest of responsibilities, as a burden thoughtfully borne by a fatherly nature at the head of a household towards a meaningful end. Or we cede our world and its future to the merely ambitious and the forces they ultimately serve, a rootless and clamoring merchant class, stamping out culture and race and exceptional uniqueness of any and every kind, and finally human spirit itself, in the service of profit margins couched in false ideals as their cover. Men who seek the destruction of everything natural, conceptions of family, hierarchy, masculinity and femininity, gender itself, and wage a war against everything lofty and exceptional and beautiful, because these ideas are so foreign to their small and cynical nature. They seek a world without depth or peaks, but rather that even keel of petty materialism, each generation a bit smaller and more tame and more easily controllable than the last. So which way, Western man? Will the future be controlled by the pioneering, adventurous, heroic, and courageous, those always seeking new shores and horizons, seeking to create, explore, expand, improve, instill order and structure and purpose? Or will this world become a marketplace, ruled by the dollar, and thus ruled by the masters of the dollar? This is our crossroads. After decades of shrinking, of being constrained and restrained, perhaps it's time to stand again, to break free of these fetters and once again become independent and fully formed human beings. If we're not capable of channeling that discipline, that back-to-basics clarity of mind, and that courage to face all obstacles and challenges, no matter how daunting they may seem, this world will become a very, very dark place. The Spartans made their choice to stand with unbended knee, loud enough to echo down through the generations. What will be our echo?